You're listening to DruidCast episode 201. Hello my friends and welcome to DruidCast episode 201. I am your host Dave the Bard, and DruidCast is brought to you on or around the 20th of the month by the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids. If you want to learn more about membership to the Order and our courses, you can do that at our website, which is at druidry.org. Opening the show, you heard Dawan, who is a touring member of the band Bog Bodies, who regular listeners to the show will know very well. And the song is called Trochier Bride and is a new single that is dedicated to the goddess Bride. Beautiful. Thank you so much for sending that in. And don't forget, you can find links to all of the artists we feature on DruidCast in the show notes. So what have I got for you as we step into the 200s? As I put together DruidCast 200 and listened to the previous episodes, I heard voices from many traditions speaking about their paths, and I think this bringing together of traditions in such a divided world is so important. I've always believed that there is so much more that we share than that differs. But also, it's important to understand where those similarities and differences lay, and to see the interesting overlaps too. So this month we continue that tradition by welcoming Pete Jennnings to the show, who has walked the heathen path for literally decades. I wanted to add Pete's voice to the wisdom already shared on the show. Now I have to say that sometimes we lose Pete's voice. I don't know what it was, maybe some Zoom auto noise setting. Either way, we couldn't seem to do much about it, but I've done my best with the recorded audio for you. We talk about how he found his path, how he became president of the Pagan Federation, his relationships to the gods, the shared love of poetry between Druid and heathen paths, so much. So grab that cuppa, jump on a long ship with me, and let's set sail along the Whale Road.
The Talkie Bit.
So I am on Zoom with Pete Jennnings, old time friend, from many years ago, heathen, well-known heathen throughout the world, written books on the subject. We were talking before we started this interview that years ago the Pagan Federation had booklets on different paths, and I remember I wrote the Druid one back in the 90s, and there was a blue covered one, and Pete wrote the blue covered one. So we've been walking these paths for a long time, and I just wanted to get your voice on the show and pick your brains about your heathen path. So welcome, Pete, to DruidCast. It's lovely to have you.
Good to see you, Dave.
Yeah. So you've been walking this path for a long time, and I remember when, in the late 80s, early 90s, there was just a distinct choice. It wasn't very eclectic back in those days.
No.
You had the northern tradition, you had Druidry, Wicca, witchcraft, and I guess shamanism as well. But the idea was that you walked, you explored, and then you chose a path.
Yeah.
How did your feet begin and end up walking the heathen path?
My earliest thoughts and so on about paganism in general was in my teens. When at that time I was in my early teens, I was a member of the Church of England, quite an active member. But then started to have questions and so on. I was fortunate; I had a very good vicar, and he would sit down and talk about anything with me, and so he was good like that. But I suppose in the end, I sort of disagreed with more than I agreed. Tried one or two other sorts of churches, and so on. And at the same time, being a teenager, liked horror films and things, and then, read your Dennis Wheatley books and so on. I thought, got a bit more to it than that. And started reading the odd book. But it was quite difficult because, this was sort of 1970. I left school in 1970. But before then, I remember going into a little independent bookshop called Orwell Books, saying, have you got anything, about paganism? Well, from underneath the counter, literally. They got out a book which was a Sybil Leek witchcraft book. It's the name you don't hear of nowadays. On top of the counter, there was all of the underground magazines of the day. There was books on how to grow your own cannabis, all that sort of stuff. But something as, And so anyway, I started to read, started to get hold of stuff. But I got married quite early. I got married when I was 21, and my first wife wasn't really keen on any sort of spiritual path. So all I did was read for about 14 years of marriage. And one of the reasons why we eventually split up was because I really felt that I needed to do things practically. So I guess, unlike a lot of people that come to paganism, I was quite well read at the time. And I'd also read, Hindu stuff and Buddhist stuff and, and so on as well. So by the time I was by myself, I knew which organisations I wanted to join. I knew which sort of path I wanted to take. And I remember joining the Pagan Federation and saying, okay, you're a network. Is there another member near me? I was living in Ipswich. And they provided me with one name as a contact, which turned out to be somebody that I already knew from folk sessions, but didn't realise they were pagan. But that was it, one.
Yeah.
I also joined hold of the Odinhof organisation and made contact with them. And they were fairly early days. I think it was with about the first year of them forming. And it was never a huge organisation, but it had some good people in it. And I ended up going off and meeting some of those and working with some of those. But one of the problems was there was very little literature at the time that was dedicated to what at that time was called the Northern Tradition, or Odinism. So I guess quite heavily influenced by the Wiccan thing to start off with, because,
it was definitely the most kind of like dominant path at the time. In fact,
yeah, I mean, at the time, back in those days, the Pagan Federation used to make a note of the sort of paths of people joining it. And, it was 70, 80% was Wiccan. And it's gradually come down over the years. And I think the last time they'd actually done some statistics, it was the first time that other paths, like Druidry and shamanism, had actually overtaken. And of course, there's a lot of people who are eclectic who don't follow any one particular path. But, let's say there wasn't much literature at the time. The literature on Odinism, there was a few books out of the United States, which it was all right, but it was pretty much 101. And I realised over a period that the Americans had a particular view of Odinism, which didn't necessarily go with the more British attitude. And I think that's continued over the years. So not entirely satisfactory. So started to do a bit of my own research. I mean, this is from about 1989 onwards. But also finding other pagans and so on the basis that we've got more in common than divides us. But lots of interesting people and ideas and got on with things like that. But wasn't part of any, I wasn't an organiser nationally or anything like that. And I really steered away from doing that because I'd come out of the job. I was a sales manager and I'd become very good at manipulating meetings professionally. It's very hard when you get into, a pagan organisation. I just avoided it and so on because I really didn't like the bloke that I used to be. I mean, I would have a point with me back then, So avoided it for some time. And I think first sort of contacts I had saying, I understand from our regional chaps that, you're into this thing called Odism. Could you write a little article about it for us? Because we've got a lot of readers who'd probably like to know, So I did it, and I look back at it. It makes me shudder. But I did what I could at the time. And then maybe about a year later, I suppose 6 months or a year later, I had this inquiry to say, will you stand for the National Committee of the Pagan Federation because we haven't got an Odinist on it? And my first reaction was, no, you really wouldn't like me in your committee.
Right.
And I had a friend at the time, a guy called Pete Sawyer, who I wrote a pathworking book with. Pete was probably the only person who could say, and he said, Pete, don't you think it's about time you faced up to your demons instead of running away from them? And I thought about it. I thought they're trying to hold the olive branch out to heathens, basically, because they are very Wiccan dominated at the moment. If I turn them down, it's like every heathen's turn them down because I'm the only one they know. Well, I think apart from maybe Friar Razwin.
That's right. She was the other name at the time.
She wasn't a member of the so I did end up going on the committee, becoming the media officer because I've got a lot of experience writing newspaper columns, doing radio shows, and so on. And eventually, of course, after 3 years of doing the media job, thinking I was then going to retire back into obscurity, they then persuaded me to do the president's job for 3 years.
Oh, yeah. So you were searching and you were looking and you got your Sybil Leek book and stuff like that. And I remember I bought books on Wicca as well. My path ended up going down the Druid path. What was the attraction for you of the heathen path? What was it that made you go, no, this is?
There's one or two things, I think. I mean, firstly, I've always been keen on history, and so on, and was interested in the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons more than any other period of history. And of course, a little later on, I became a Viking reenactor, and then after that, an Anglo-Saxon reenactor. And I've only just closed my group down last year. I'm still doing a bit as a guest with other people, but so it wasn't I wanted to reenact paganism sort of thing, but that was my historical period, and I felt more drawn to that sort of thing than I did to, let's say, more Celtic. I liked the fact that it was quite independent thinking, nobody said there's a set degree structure, or a set training period, and I guess all paganism is a spiritual path not laid up on a plate for you. You have to find your own way, but heathenry even more so. It has a lot of homework to do. And so I liked that. And the more I explored it, the more that sort of feed into my feelings of wanting to be responsible for myself, I suppose, and not looking to others to do things for me. Other people would call it belligerence and stubbornness. And there was very much an equality between the sectors within heathenism, both within the gods and goddesses and people who worship them, although at the time I joined, it was a heavily male-dominated path. I think maybe because it had that macho Viking sort of thing. But funnily enough, over the years, it attracted a lot of ladies who were also attracted to that macho Viking thing, and you found out that they were Viking reenactors as well, and things like that. Now, that's still not a 50-50 balance, but I think it's more sort of 40-60 probably. Yeah, just rough rule of thumb from what I see, and that's good, and it's changed the flavour of heathenry for the better.
Do you think that obviously, the old Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Mercia, Sussex, East Anglia, Northumbria, you're in Ipswich.
Yeah.
One of the East Anglian counties.
Yeah.
Was that an influence? Do you think it was part
I mean, I very much, although I moved away from Ipswich something like 30 years ago, and I live over the Suffolk border into Essex now in a small village, I still very much identify as a Suffolk boy and Ipswich boy. Sure, why it was that was so important. Funny enough, a few years ago, I ended up going into my genealogy. I had a cousin in Canada who made contact and supplied all my mum's side, both sides of her family. And I went and done my dad's side. And it turns out that all 4 lines of my family are of Suffolk through and through. They weren't very adventurous. They got from Bury St Edmunds to Ipswich in 400 years, and were all sort of farm workers. So, there was that in it. Although then because of that, I went and had the DNA done, which I think you've had done as well.
I have, yes.
I found out that I was sort of 64%, I think it is, general British mongrel mix. 10% Scandinavian, and then 7% Irish, and then lots of small percentages, East European, West European, Iberian Peninsula. So all of those things, I suppose, the Kingdom of East Anglia, the Woffings and so on, and Sutton Hoo, and all of those things added together, I suppose, to give me that feel of belonging. And, you must have heard this a million times like me. that somebody comes into paganism, whatever path they come into, go, it's like coming home.
Yeah, you hear it all.
We've all heard it loads of times. The word becomes a cliche.
Yeah.
And, I felt that thing and so on. But I suppose it really, in many sort of practical ways, it was like coming home. And I suppose psychologically, that's important to me because I've always felt the odd one out.
Mm.
I wasn't like the other little boys.
No, I remember staying at a gig once, looking out to all the pagans, saying this is where all the people who didn't fit in school ended up. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
I do get that feeling from a lot of us. We didn't fit in.
I came from a very rough council estate, and I mean rough in its for very working class parents and so on. When I was 11, I passed the 11 plus and went to grammar school. The only kid for several square miles to go to grammar school, which meant that when I went out my door, I was sometimes met with a hail of stones. And these were the kids I'd been to junior school with.
Yeah.
When I got to grammar school, I was the rough boy, quite badly bullied and so on, and also really didn't fit into the mindset of a lot of the people there, or the social class or anything else. So I guess, always felt a bit of an odd one out. And, at times that's a big disadvantage. But I suppose over the years I've turned it to my advantage, Whilst other kids were playing football, I went off and sang in bands and things like that, I was never into sport. So
you said you were quite interested in religious things from an early age, and you explored paganism, found the heathen path. Of course, that leads us then to the heathen gods.
Yeah.
So, what are your thoughts on the heathen gods? Are you? Would you like say you were polytheistic, animistic?
When I started off, I was into Odin, the best known one, and so on. But was acknowledging the other gods and goddesses as well. The goddesses being very important because that was something that I found in the Christian church was that women were very badly represented and treated, sort of thing. I felt there should be a feminine side. Later on, I guess I veered a bit more towards Thunor, as more a god of the common people. And in fact, Odin really, considering what the Norse ideal was for a person, to be truthful and straightforward in dealings and not to end up being adulterous and things like that. He'd done all of those things.
Yeah.
So makes it curious. I think the perception nowadays is he was never the main god. He was a god skewed by the leadership, kings and so on, that the ordinary common people who wanted a good harvest would look to Thor, they'd look to Frey and Freya and things like that. Over the years, I'm quite happy to talk about red-haired bloke on a big beard on a chariot with a couple of goats and his hammer and so on. The popular film image or whatever. But in my quieter moment in my head, he's a representation, a sort of an archetype, which to me is partly about righteous anger. I hate things being unfair. So,
right.
And having at one stage trained and qualified as a psychotherapist, I'm aware of all the little bits and pieces in my own head. You end up being taken to pieces and back together again. And it's a bit like that idea of, the good and, the two little imps on your shoulders, eat the cake. No, don't eat the cake. Got all these little impulses going on. And so I think of my gods and goddesses as parts of my higher self. There's one bit which is righteous anger. There's another bit which is nurturing. There's another bit which is bloody pugnacious. They're good, they're bad, they're indifferent. and so on, but they're all parts of me. And sometimes I have to try and concentrate on getting in touch with one bit rather than another bit. The trouble is, if you start to explain, well, I'm trying to get in touch with my righteous anger side, that's quite difficult for people to understand, I think. And it's a bit airy-fairy, whereas it's like, right, I need to get in touch with Thor. That registers something. Yeah, you've got to go in there and, if it moved, hit it. That's the thing. So yeah, I'm quite happy to play along with the images, and it makes it easier for me to think and picture them.
Yeah.
Sometimes, But
so you feel that these spirits are part of you. You don't necessarily invoke their energy.
I think they're embodiments of part of me, but I also think that they also exist externally of me.
Right.
And what I normally explain it is it's like the wind. Most of us have a belief in the wind. We've seen it blowing the leaves along. And you get some clever scientists who say, well, it's a difference in atmospheric pressure between this area and the other area. And the air flows down to the empty bit and so on. Most people accept that. But the trouble is, none of us have actually ever seen the wind, effects of the wind. So we've all bought into this belief, well, most of us, that the wind changes in barometric pressure. Now, part of the Norse mythology is a bloody great eagle, Walter Ravenhill, that sits on top of the world tree Yggdrasil flapping its wings. And that's what causes the wings. And that was a theory. You can say, well, is the modern theory any better than that? Because you can't prove either of them. I quite like the picture of an eagle flapping its wings.
Most, the mythologies of that, because that image to me is incredibly powerful and beautiful. This giant eagle, and I go outside and I'm basking in the energy created by this.
Yeah,
I guess that's the bard in me loves that.
Yeah. And sometimes there's like inner truths in these things. They might be difficult. I'm currently working, doing some study and research and so on Ragnarok, the creation of the world and the destruction. And I've been familiar with the material for 40 years or something or other. But I was looking at it again, and if you look at the Norse creation myth, you've got this void, Ginnungagap, gap, and into it, from one direction, comes some sort of fog, water vapor, whatever, ice, and the other direction comes fire. And they meet, and between them, that meeting causes the creates the world, and it all goes on from there. But you compare that first little bit, the Ginnungagap bit, with what they reckon existed before the Big Bang. They're not that different. Okay, the Big Bang is in more scientific language and more specific language, but if you was trying to do it as a poet, it wouldn't be that different, And so maybe they had it all the time and didn't know it.
It's a fantastic creation myth, and as someone who's followed the Druid path for a number of years, it's part of the Norse tradition that I kind of go, I wish we had something similar in Druidry, because there is no creation myth in Druidry.
You could borrow it.
Well, you know what? I think that it's only humans, to me, that create these barriers between paths.
Yes,
and that wisdom can be found everywhere. Yeah. And so I felt absolutely inspired by the old Norse creation myth as a Druid.
Yeah.
I've seen in a way, I've always thought of myself, it's that integration of the red and white dragon in me. There's the red dragon in me and there's the white dragon in me.
Yeah.
And within myself, I can integrate that and bring peace to that as well, So I love it, love that creation myth. Absolutely.
Yeah. One of the things I'm doing at the moment is with every sort of giant god, whatever within the creation myth, is looking to see what their names actually mean.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to do that as a separate thing. But, if you find, that somebody who's fiery is meeting somebody who's icy, then there's more to the story than just a punch up, or or something. And I'm still exploring that. I don't know where it's going to lead or whether it will lead anywhere, which is the nice thing of doing research. I enjoy research as much as writing the book. The books are just a record of my research normally, and I hope that people enjoy them and get something out of them. But otherwise, they're for me. And if I only ever sold one copy, I don't care.
Yeah,
well, I would care, but I don't care that much.
So I'd like, as I've got you on the show, I'd like to ask you some specific questions about.
Dude, far away.
It's always confused me, and one of them is that and this is really stupid, probably to a lot of heathens. So
there's no such thing as a stupid question.
And yourself for even mentioning this, but of course, it feels to me like the heathen path is very much stems from a warrior culture. And that the idea of dying with a sword or axe in your hand on the battlefield and ending up in the halls of Valhalla where you will drink mead and feast with your fellow warriors seems to be one of the main things within the mythologies that I've read. Yeah. That sounds to me like absolute horrible. I'd hate.
I agree. There's no way I want to go to Valhalla.
Yeah,
I've spent many years as a combatant in reenactment, but that's pretend. It's a thing that very rarely comes out in books, but literally all the gods and goddesses are listed as having halls. And the one that I actually want to go to is Sesrum the Hall, which is owned by Freya.
So she has her own hall where...
Yeah, Sesrum means many-seated. And it's only... The warriors that are chosen for Valhalla are those ones who've died bravely, in battle. Haven't necessarily won, but, died bravely because they're idiots. Selected by the Valkyries, who cart them off, and half go to Odin, and half goes to Freya anyway.
Right.
Which doesn't make Freya a Valkyrie. She's not. I've fairly well proved that within some of my writings. But, you can choose what gods and goddesses you follow. And I think express a preference where you'd like to end up. And where I'd like to end up is the sort of family hall where you can have your family with you. I'm hoping my dogs, although Freya is rather into cats, so, maybe they will get on okay.
They're in that hall with all the dogs, but,
Well, I sadly lost my latest dog last week, and as she was in my arms, at the vet's, and the last thing I said was, Odin, take her.
Yeah.
Because I believe Odin likes dogs because he had a couple of wolves,
Indeed.
Jerry. It's my belief that however it happens in the next life, that somehow I will be in contact now. Now, I don't really believe in, sort of place up there in the sky sort of thing. But, I do believe that maybe you have some sort of consciousness after death. They say that nothing can be completely destroyed. You can change form, so that little sparks of energy that we have going through a brain, that electricity, it can't be destroyed. It can only be changed into heat or light or, another form of energy. And I like to think that, maybe my brain will continue thinking, oh, I'm in a nice place, and it's my old dog come to see me, and
there's your old dog.
It's my wife, and and the girlfriends. That's awkward.
That sounds lovely, mate. Honestly, that sounds great to me as well.
Yeah. The warriors that go to Valhalla, they're expected to fight each day and feast each night, and then we'll get there and do it again tomorrow. And they're there to help Odin when it gets to Ragnarok, the end of the world. And in fact, they all die horribly because Odin doesn't even survive. But funnily enough, within the Norse mythology, of course, you get this sort of most of the gods and their opponents and so on dying at Ragnarok. But then there are some survivors, which is unusual in any mythology. You get a couple of humans who survive, and repopulate, and you get one or two gods and goddesses that survive. So that's quite unusual for mythology, but the Norse mythology is unusual anyway. Every other mythology that has a tree of life, like we have Yggdrasil, a tree of life, 9 worlds. Normally, you get the human world at the bottom.
Yeah.
No, we have it in the middle.
Yeah.
The North and Anglo-Saxon people obviously thought they were the centre of the world and everything else should revolve around.
Around us. Yes, indeed.
But yeah, so I hope that answers your question. No, there's lots of halls to choose from, and you don't have to be a warrior. That'd be my worst nightmare too.
That perfectly answers that question. I have another question.
Yeah.
So I'm a bard. I've worked my way through the Kobold Greys, but found that my home is always in the bardic tradition of storytelling, poetry, of seeing the world through the eyes of a poet. Within the Druid tradition, the patrons of the bards are Ceridwen and Bridget or Bride. You know, and the Awen is the flowing spirit of inspiration.
Yeah.
And I know within poetry was so important to our Anglo-Saxon and North ancestors too.
Very, very.
And you had the skalds and you had the shops in Anglo-Saxon.
Yes. Yeah.
Who are there equivalents that would be the inspiration and of the?
Yeah, you've got Bragi.
Bragi.
Yeah. Bragi is a god of poetry, but also you've got Kvasir, and Kvasir actually gets killed by some dwarfs, and they mix his blood with honey and make mead, and the mead is inspiration for everybody. Everybody goes loquacious when they've had a bottle of mead, and so on. So there's that. But poetry, we don't know how it was everywhere. But if you look at what happened in Iceland, to be a Gothai in Iceland, you had to be a landowner, you had to be a good warrior, but you also had to be able to do poetry.
Mm-hmm.
If you couldn't do that, they weren't going to have you as a leader. No, he's uneducated. My favourite Viking saga is Ael's saga. If you never ever read any other saga, read Ael's saga in translation into English. And Ael, at one point, he's a clever guy. He's big. He fights and so on, but he also knows runes and all sorts of stuff. And at one time, he's really upset a particular king and queen by erecting a knitting pole, a bit of magic to drive them out of Norway, which succeeds. So he's not their flavour of the month. They end up going and taking over a country, a small area of England, around York, and he ends up shipwrecked on their coast. Now, he could have slunk along the coast and, found a friend and got away, but he didn't, because I don't slink away from anybody, So he sort of gives himself up and says, "Yeah, you're on my own." And the queen says, "Kill him." And the king goes, "No, I can't do that because it's night time, and killing somebody at night is classed as murder because that's all secret and dark. We'll have to wait till tomorrow morning." So he's left to himself in a cell all night, and he composes a poem about the king. And when they bring him in front of the king in the morning, he says, "Before we kill, we just have a listen to this." And he says how the king has won this battle and has done this and done that. And the king is then really stuffed, because laws of hospitality are very specific and very highly regarded. And you would be very badly thought of to kill a person who has almost given him immortality by writing a poem about him.
In these words. Oh.
And so he says, "Get out. If you ever come back to this country, I will execute you. But,
thanks for the poem."
And so on. And so that poem is known as Ael's Neck Saver.
Oh, right.
Yeah. And a bit of it is still in existence.
Yeah.
And so on. So, poetry really, really. And I mean, Norse people always think Vikings, big and as violent and so on. But, things like poetry and so really, really important
Yeah.
to them. And not everybody was a warrior anyway. Yeah, most of them were farmers. Never saw a sword from one year to the next, probably. So it's not about attitude, but of course, stories about fighting are always much more interesting and fun than stories about farming.
Yeah. But Odin was also a poet, wasn't he? I mean, he's
Oh yes, yeah. And of course, it's Odin that gets the knowledge of the runes from Freya, or the Seer of Magic, and the runes from Yggdrasil, and does all this magic stuff, which on one hand is cool, isn't he clever?
Yeah.
But on another level is he cheats.
Yeah.
And you get this in the sagas, if the hero uses runes to defeat his enemies, well, he's troll-wise, he's clever, If the enemy uses runes or magic, it's cheating, well, it's just a sort of dirty, low-down trick you'd expect. They're quite hypocritical about it.
What are your thoughts on Snorri? Not snoring, as we said before.
Yes.
Yeah, so he was an Icelandic monk, I think, or something like that.
No, not a monk. He was a diplomat.
He was a diplomat, okay.
Diplomat, politician, 13th century, and very interested in history and poetry and so on. And he wrote several things. He's best known for a book called an Edda, which basically tells a lot of the Norse mythology on the excuse that I need poets to get it right, so because it's all Christian now in Iceland, you don't know the old tales. So when you're referring to the old days, you don't know who to refer to. So these tales will tell you. Nothing to do with keeping the stories going. He had access to quite a few documents that never survived. He also, I believe, embellished bits, added bits on. But he was a clever diplomat. And he used to sit and discuss politics in a hot tub with his mates at a place called Reykholt. I've dabbled my hand in that hot tub. It's still hot.
Yeah.
It's fed from the underground springs, which are all volcanic, of course. You got springs like that all over Iceland. If there's one person that I'd like to meet in the world, for him to be able to converse with me in English, it would be Snorri Sturluson. There's so many questions I would have for him.
And so the prose Edda is a translation of an old document, but the poetic Edda is the translation of the old document, and his is the prose Edda. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. The poetic Edda is a lot of different poems by a lot of different people from different time periods, and in fact, there's 3 versions, and they're slightly different collections each one, and slightly different versions as well, because they were written down. I think probably a lot of them were carried orally. People made them up, and it wasn't until later that somebody wrote them down. But the fact, because they weren't a terribly literate society. Yes, they've got runes to read and write with, but not many people did. Which means they must have had fantastic memories. Like I said about Ale making up a poem overnight to recite to the king. He hasn't got to just make it up. He's got to learn it off by heart and recite it. And it's not just like making up any poem, We can all probably make up a limerick, probably rude or whatever. But when you consider within Norse poetry, there are at least 12 poetic meters. And you use different ones for different jobs. If you're praising a king, you do one. If you're doing a heroic tale, you do it in another meter. And there's even a meter for saying magical stuff and so on. And you mustn't get them mixed up. And they're fiendishly complicated. I tried to understand them, and I must admit I gave up because I didn't need to really know them. I wasn't about to, write a poem in Old Norse, so I didn't do it. But even in English, the rhyming systems and so on. And then there's not just the rhyming systems. You have things called pennings, And kennings are poetic ways of saying things. So instead of saying the sea, you would say the fisher's bath.
Yeah. The Whale Road.
Yeah, the whale road. And people will know, oh, yeah, we know what he's referring to, but it's nicer than keep saying the sea,
Yeah.
you know. And, of course, some of those will be, you know, I drank Kvasir's blood, which the audience would know Kvasir's blood is mead.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you've got to know your mythology. And so quite a few of the things that are repeated within the Eddas refer to other tales that we've got absolutely no idea what they were and what they contain. You know, I suspect they're only 10% of what the total was over a field. And of course, Iceland had an advantage in as much as they didn't convert to Christianity till around about 1000 AD, and even then they were allowed to practice heathenism privately within their homes for a few years after. Whereas if you look at Anglo-Saxon England, most kings were converting in the mid-600s and so on. And okay, it didn't go all the way down to the peasantry, but at least the hoi polloi were basically, at least nominally, by the late 600s, even if they split their bets sometimes, like King Redwold, who had heathen altar with you.
Yeah, their bet.
Whose temple we've now found, of course.
Yeah, and the thing is that the people who held on to those heathen beliefs in what became England, they weren't the literate people. They weren't the ones that were able to write it down. And
no,
we've lost so much mythology in England.
And every now and again, you get a little clue of there's something going on. When I do reenactment as an Anglo-Saxon, I have what's known as a Biagnoth sax, which is a one-edged weapon, and the blade is about a yard long, and it's got runes down it. And the runes are the basic Anglo-Saxon thorp, not the older Norse Viking 24. This is the 32 or whatever.
Yeah.
And then at the end, it's got a name spelt out, Biagnoth. Well, but it was found in the mud by London Bridge, and it's been absolutely dated to 9th, 10th century. Yeah. Now, if it was a Viking weapon, you could say, well, maybe a few Vikings kept pagan, but it's not. It's an Anglo-Saxon weapon. So what was an Anglo-Saxon doing in the 9th century, having runes down his sacks? Yeah. And in fact, whoever had made them on there weren't that familiar with them, because they made a small mistake and had to witch something in that they'd missed out and so on. But somebody was going, I'm going to have this the old way. So we get little clues that there were things. The other thing I've written about is Anglo-Saxon law codes. And inevitably, when kings start to be Christian, they have a law code, and and the first one on a law code is, don't steal and that. But you get down to law number 4 or 5, and it's stop being a pagan, stop worshipping at wells or whatever it is, yeah. And then 50 years later, you get another king come in, and he brings out a law code, and the first laws are just the same, but then he has his law 5, stop being a pagan and stop worshipping at trees and saluting the moon. There's no mention of wells. And you think, you don't make laws against things that don't exist. I don't know of any laws in this country that stop you from walking an elephant down the road.
Yeah.
Because very few people try and walk elephants down the road, Great way of protest, wasn't it?
Well, Pete, as you say, there's no law against it.
No, you don't pass a law until it becomes a problem. So these kings will pass laws because it was a problem. But the interesting thing is, each set of laws comes up with something a little bit different. So in other words, they've stopped them worshipping the world, so they've started worshipping trees or saluting the moon or doing this. And this goes on all the way until the early thousands.
Right.
So we're talking about 400 years past when most people were supposed to convert to Christianity. They're still having to say, don't consult with enchanters that do fortune telling, you know. There's one that says, and astrologers. Who the hell ever heard of astrologers in Anglo-Saxon England? I've found no other reference to another. There's also some bishops' edicts which are put out, which are almost like sets of laws of themselves. There's one that says, and do not burn grain at the house of a dead man. What the hell's that about? Once again, I haven't found any references to it in continental stuff or anywhere else, and I've looked for years. Yeah. But it was, was the grain, was it because it made a nasty smell and would drive the spirits out? Because I've actually experimented. I've got some barley and set fire to it with difficulty, and it smells, it smells like burnt toast, basically. Yeah. I've actually specified within my own funeral, which I've written years ago, that there will be grain burnt in my house when I die. Mm-hmm. Simply because they hated it so much to make a law against it.
There'll be a reason.
It must be important, so I'm having it.
Well, look, Pete, we have been speaking for nearly an hour, and yeah, I know, it's amazing. There's so many questions. Oh, maybe I'll get you back on the show and we'll continue this conversation, because there's lots of other questions that I've got for you. But thank you for spending this time with me on Druid.
Glad to.
There's a frost on the ground and a nip in the air. I won't believe in tonight. Such a cold winter moon. So come and save me, and we'll stick our toes in the fire. You can wrap me up warm in your arms, with my heart with a hot drink and a good cigar. Then I'll run you about, scrub you back. There's room for one more by the I hear the snap of cold trees, see a dark sullen sky, and the birds in the garden sing to old Mother Night. We don't need their approval for all the strange things that we do. So scratch me with your toenails and we'll break loose. And who's on the phone? Let 'em ring. It can't be you, so ignore the damn thing. And who's at the door? Let 'em knock. Don't let them win. No, don't let the cold in. Will you come back to bed? Will you sleep? Dream of me and a sheepish moon. Come on to the sheets where it's warm. miles around this storm.
After the interview with Pete, you heard Carrying the Great Cold on Our Backs, a song from the latest album from Oddfellows Casino called the Lewis Psychfest Sessions. Oh man, I just love that early Floyd's Syd Barrett vibe. As ever, my friends, thank you for sending that into the show. But this music means we are approaching the end of the show, but before I go, let's have the results of last month's competition. The prize is a handcrafted sterling silver Arwen pendant. That was Brian's ovate gift to the order, and he kindly sent that in to be a prize for DruidCast. And the question I asked was, during show 200, you heard an interview with a musician and bard who was in a band that played Woodstock back in the 60s. What was that band's name? Well, the answer is The Incredible String Band, and the first name drawn from the hat and winner of that beautiful pendant is Annie Robinson from Darlington. Congratulations, Annie. That pendant will be with you very soon. The prize this month is a copy of Valkyrie's Selectors of Heroes, Their Roles Within Viking and Anglo-Saxon Heathen Beliefs, a book by our guest Pete Jennings. And the question I'd like you to answer is, what is the most commonly known name of Odin's Hall? What is the most commonly known name of Odin's Hall? Quite an easy one there. Email your answer along with your full postal address to podcast@druidry.org, and one of you will win that fabulous book. Well, my friends, that is a show. Have a wonderful equinox celebration, and I will see you next month for episode 202. But until then, I wish you all, as ever, peace and blessed be. Goodbye.